Russian President Vladimir Putin is panicking. Just as Russia announces it's not able to accept US proposals for a ceasefire in Ukraine, Putin mobilizes 160,000 more troops that he's intending to send into Ukraine. But what Vladimir doesn't realize is that his new mobilization plan might just blow up in his face. On March 31, Politico was among the first news outlets to report on Putin's plan to conscript another 160,000 citizens to Russia's military. The move isn't unusual for Russia. Euronews says that the country holds conscriptions twice every year, typically during the spring and fall. The last round saw Putin boost his military by 133,000 soldiers, all of whom signed on for a year of military service. Putin also raised the conscription age from 27 to 30 in 2024, showcasing that Russia was struggling to find younger conscripts. These conscriptions add to Russia's September 2022 partial mobilization, which saw Putin bring 300,000 soldiers into Russia's military. That was also an unpopular move, as the Kyiv Independent says that Putin's first mobilization led to 261,000 Russians fleeing their homes to avoid being drafted into his insane war. The latest order, which goes into effect on April 1, will see Russia draft 160,000 men aged between 18 and 30 years old. It won't be immediate. Russia needs time to gather the names of its conscripts, with Putin intending his new soldiers to be ready for deployment by July 15. But there is one bright spot for Ukraine. While Russia intends to conscript 160,000 new soldiers, that doesn't necessarily mean that Russia's military presence in Ukraine will grow by the same amount. Politico says that some of Russia's existing conscripts will be dismissed from the military, having already served their terms. Just how many that will be is unknown. After all, Russia has lost over 916,000 soldiers to death, injury or capture since February 2022, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance. Many of those soldiers were likely conscripted, meaning those who are heading home are few in number. So why is Putin doing this now? It's simple. He appears to believe that Russia is finally winning the Ukraine war. He stated as much on March 28, claiming, "I just recently said we will finish them off. There is no reason to believe that we will not finish them off." Putin also added that he feels the strategic initiative of the Ukraine invasion is now entirely in the hands of the Russian armed forces along with the entire front line. He even produced statistics to back that statement up. According to Putin, Russia now controls 99% of Luhansk, along with 70% of Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, and the Donetsk Oblast. That was his chief target throughout much of 2024. However, there's no denying that the timing of this latest conscription round is a little off. Granted, it's coming at around the same time as every round of spring conscription Russia implements. But 2025 is different from any other year seen in the Ukraine war thus far. As we speak, Putin is negotiating with Trump to implement at least a partial ceasefire in his invasion. Those negotiations have led to Ukraine and Russia almost putting pen to paper on an agreement to halt attacks on each other's energy infrastructure, as well as to stop attacks in the Black Sea. That makes the timing of Russia's latest round of conscription suspicious. If Putin wants peace, why is he replenishing his army to such a massive degree? And what does Russia's latest round of mobilization mean for the Ukraine war? On the Russian side, Putin bringing another 160,000 soldiers into his military demonstrates that he's not even slightly serious about any efforts to secure peace in the invasion that he started. We'd had plenty of hints about this before. For instance, just a day before Putin announced the new wave of conscription, Zelensky was in the media talking about how he doesn't believe a word that Putin says. "I've never been afraid. It's just Putin wanting war. What can a man who wants war say at peace talks?" Zelensky asked when speaking to Le Monde. "I'm not going to swallow his narrative." Zelensky added, "I'm not interested." In other words, Zelensky appeared to believe that Putin was disingenuous in his claims that he wanted to achieve peace. To Ukraine, 160,000 more soldiers being added to Russia's army comes as no surprise at all. The US has also gotten a very recent taste of Putin's propensity for talking out of both sides of his mouth. Speaking to NBC toward the end of March, Donald Trump said that he was both very angry and pissed off at Putin after several weeks of attempting to negotiate a ceasefire had borne no fruit. The comments came after Putin attacked Zelensky's credibility as Ukraine's leader, essentially implying that Ukraine needs to hold elections before Russia will consider peace. Of course, those are elections that Putin would try to influence, with Trump saying that new leadership means you're not going to have a deal for a long time. Trump then made an interesting threat. If Russia and I are unable to make a deal on stopping the bloodshed in Ukraine, and if I think it was Russia's fault, which it might not be, I'm going to put secondary tariffs on all oil coming out of Russia. Those tariffs are interesting. Trump says that they'll be between 25 and 50%, but they won't be applied to Russia's oil directly. Instead, any country that buys Russia's oil will have to deal with those tariffs on all goods they export to the United States under Trump's plan. It's an interesting gambit, and a move that suggests that Trump believes Putin isn't taking ceasefire talks seriously. Russia's newest round of conscription will only add to those beliefs as Trump and Zelensky question why Putin will be growing his army while he's supposedly negotiating for peace. Peace isn't in Putin's vocabulary, at least when it comes to Ukraine. That's according to the Atlantic Council, which pointed out that Putin's initial response to ceasefire talks was evasive. His negotiating tactics haven't changed much since. For instance, though he initially agreed to a Black Sea ceasefire with Trump, he later changed the conditions to only agreeing to that ceasefire if the US lifted its sanctions against Russia's banks. Putin is sending Trump on a fool's errand, according to the Kyiv Independent, with every negotiation tactic he uses being designed to drag out ceasefire talks for as long as possible so Russia can keep attacking Ukraine. The reality is that Putin is obsessed with taking control of Ukraine. That obsession has lasted for almost 2 decades, starting with his attempts to rig Ukraine's presidential election to install a Russia-friendly president back in 2004. That meddling failed, sparking a revolution, and in 2014, more moves toward democracy triggered Putin to annex Crimea and manipulate pro-Russian forces inside Ukraine to start a war. Of course, 2022 brought with it the start of Putin's so-called special military operation, showcasing how Ukraine has never been far from his mind. Over the past 3 years, Putin has become increasingly open about his intention to erase Ukraine altogether, says the Atlantic Council. He has declared occupied Ukrainian regions to be Russian forever, and has compared his invasion to the 18th century imperial conquests of Russian ruler Peter the Great. And it's these delusions of grandeur that fuel everything that Putin does. He wants to go down in history as the great Russian leader who restored Ukraine to what he sees as its rightful place as part of the Russian Federation. Ukraine as a concept, as a country, shouldn't exist in Putin's mind. That shows us what Putin is likely doing with the ongoing ceasefire negotiations, and what this latest round of conscriptions may really mean. He's just trying to use Trump to bait Zelensky, without any real promises of following through, and even if Putin does agree to a ceasefire, it would only last for 30 days before he's right back to his invasion. Bringing another 160,000 soldiers into the Russian military now just showcases how Putin is trying to play the rest of the world, speaking about peace from one side of his mouth and talks about further militarization from the other. Those 160,000 soldiers could flow into Ukraine now or could arrive after an initial ceasefire, but it makes no difference to Putin. He isn't going to stop his war. Still, Putin's latest conscription round reveals other things about Russia's military. For one, it's the largest conscription drive Putin has undertaken since he began his invasion. That doesn't mean that Putin is trying to press his advantage, as he would like the rest of the world to believe. Instead, the 160,000 soldiers entering Russia's military are more likely a sign of Putin's desperation because Russia is running out of soldiers. We've known that much since at least January 2025, which is when the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, published an analysis of Russia's soldier situation. At the time, Russia had lost up to 700,000 soldiers, CEPA claimed, with recruitment via conscription and contracting mercenaries barely covering those losses. CEPA points to Russia being forced to use draftees to counter Ukraine's invasion of Kursk in August 2024, followed up by bringing in soldiers from North Korea for the same purpose as a measure of Putin's desperation. By resorting to such desperate measures, CEPA says, Moscow was able to maintain combat pressure and slowly extend its occupation of Ukrainian territory, though its slow progress would not be considered a success when judged against Russian military theory. Putin's problem is now twofold, says CEPA. Not only is he dealing with massive combat losses, which drain his military almost as quickly as he supplements it, but he's also having to put up with a stark lack of willing recruits. United 24 Media also highlighted this recruitment problem in a February 2025 piece. It noted that Russia has suffered losses amounting to around half of its military total personnel since Putin started his invasion. Toward the end of 2024, the country's losses had mounted to the point where it was losing 1,500 soldiers daily to Putin's attritional meat grinder strategy. At the same time, Russia was recruiting just 1,000 willing volunteers to the military daily. If we just take the last 3 months of 2024 as a sample, which is when Russia's losses first started cracking the 1,500 per day mark, we see 92 days in which the country has a big recruitment shortfall of 500 soldiers per day. That adds up to a 46,000 soldier gap from just 3 months. That's why Putin needed to conscript again. He's so hell-bent on destroying Ukraine that he can't see any way out of the situation he's created other than to continue fighting. But with losses mounting up so severely, he can no longer rely on contracts with bumper pay packets to attract people to Russia's military. So he needs to force more people to join under the threat of imprisonment. Those new conscripts, of course, aren't going to be motivated for Putin's fight. If they were, they would have joined at any point during the past 3 years. That lack of motivation will carry over into their training and eventually into their actions on the front lines. What exactly does that mean for Russia? Putin may have just brought another 160,000 soldiers into the fold, but the majority of them will likely be little more than poorly trained cannon fodder, operating purely on survival instinct. If Putin's meat grinder is bad right now, it's going to get worse as these almost untrained conscripts get pushed out onto the front lines come the summer. Still, Putin won't care, as despite the many manpower problems in his military, this latest round of conscription does achieve a goal. It keeps the pressure on Ukraine. Putin's invasion has been attritional since he failed to take Ukraine in 5 days as he initially believed he would, and attrition has clearly taken a toll on Russia's army. However, we can't underestimate the impact it's having on Ukraine. As Politico pointed out in February, Ukraine is dealing with many of the same manpower issues Russia faces. For instance, January 2025 saw Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky issue an order to transfer 5,000 of the country's Air Force personnel to Ukraine's ground forces. That order caused some alarm, as it seemed that Ukraine was sending some of its most specialized troops into unspecialized roles. As Secretary of State Marco Rubio said at his confirmation hearing, the problem that Ukraine is facing is not that they're running out of money, it's that they're running out of Ukrainians. Politico says that higher numbers of Ukraine's soldiers are going AWOL, with difficulty in finding recruits impacting Ukraine just as it is Russia. Ukraine has tried to counteract this problem. In May 2024, it instituted new mobilization laws of its own that require all men in the country between the ages of 18 and 60 to register with Ukraine's military. Not all of those men are being called up, but they still need to register and carry their recruitment documents at all times in case they're mobilized. Putin knows this. That's why he's sticking with his attritional strategy. For as many problems as his approach is creating with the Russian military, he knows that Ukraine is dealing with similar issues. To Putin, his invasion is a game of who can last longer, and on the sheer manpower front, Russia has the advantage. It may be losing more soldiers than Ukraine, but it also has more troops to spare. Russia's population is a touch under 140 million, which is over 100 million more than the 35.6 million who call Ukraine home. Of those people, 46.1 million are classified as fit for service by Global Firepower, which ranks military nations based on over 60 ranking factors. Ukraine has just 12.7 million who are capable of fighting. Russia has also about 4 times the number of people reaching military age annually. All of this feeds into Putin's strategy and partially explains why he's conscripting another 160,000 soldiers. He's playing the long game, and eventually he knows that Ukraine is going to run out of people before Russia. But what Putin may not realize is that as he plays this numbers game, his latest round of conscription could be the one that ultimately blows up in his face for 2 main reasons. It angers everyday Russians, and it feeds into the population problems Russia is dealing with domestically. One reality Putin refuses to face is that most of his people don't have the same appetite for war as he has. Putin might argue that's also the case in Ukraine, and he wouldn't necessarily be wrong. The difference is that those fighting Ukraine are defending their lives, their homes, and their nation, while everybody that Putin conscripts is being forced into a war which many want no part. And the sentiment from the Russian population proves it. On March 26, the Eurasian Times examined the results of a poll conducted by the US-based Filter Labs. It found that 45% of Russians believe it's necessary to move into peace talks with Ukraine, while 43% express ongoing support for Putin's military operation. It's a slim majority for peace, sure, though we also need to recognize that many Russians will claim to support Putin's war when they really don't for fear of retaliation from the Russian regime. Perhaps a more accurate measure of how many Russians want peace comes from the fact that 76% said they'd support Putin's decision if he signed a peace agreement. Of those, 55% said they'd support a ceasefire with no preconditions. Again, these are slim majorities, but they all point toward the appetite for war waning in Russia. Yet Putin is now pushing another 160,000 people into military service. And with so many ready for peace, you have to wonder how much more Russia's people will take before they get so fed up with Putin that they start to rebel against him. After all, Putin's manpower issues in his military are a microcosm of what's happening in Russia as a whole. The country has a major labor shortage, according to the Institute for the Study of War. The country has record low unemployment rates of around 2.3%, which isn't quite the positive sounding metric it seems to be. What that rate suggests is that there are no people for the jobs Russia is producing. That problem is exacerbated by the up to 900,000 economically mobile workers who fled Russia when Putin invaded Ukraine, the 900,000 or so losses Russia has suffered on the Ukrainian battleground, and now the order to conscript another 160,000 soldiers to the military. Add to all of this a shift in Russia's migration policies following the March 2024 Crocus City Hall terrorist attacks, and you get a country that is hurtling toward a population crisis. A crisis that isn't going to get any better when Putin is sacrificing yet more of Russia's young men to the altar of his expansionist ambition. Given that Russia's birth rate is also at catastrophic levels, according to Kremlin mouthpiece Dmitry Peskov, Putin's decision seems especially short-sighted. Right now, fewer children are being born in Russia than any point in the past 25 years. Between January and June of 2024, 599,600 children were born in Russia, 16,000 less than the year before. Consider the impact of sending men aged 18 to 30 into battle against Ukraine is going to have on those birth rates. Many of those men will die, and many likely won't have started families before going off to fight. So, not only will Russia lose those men at a time when it's dealing with a population crisis, but that crisis will only worsen as time goes on and the birth rate keeps declining. As the Telegraph speculates in a March 31 article, Putin's latest conscription drive may be starting to turn his own people against him. The heavy losses have led to a wide conscription crisis, which has caused Putin to offer salaries far above the average for young men to go to the front line. The outlet says, "Do not underestimate the anger of these families. When Moscow was at war with Afghanistan in the 1980s, it was the mothers of soldiers that formed the front line of the anti-war movement. Today, Russian mothers are writing to Putin as they grieve the loss of their children to Putin's ambition. It's impossible to live like this," said one of those mothers, according to the Telegraph, which may be the Achilles heel of Putin's latest conscription round. He sees bulking up his military numbers as a way to exert more pressure on Ukraine while he believes he has the advantage. But in his own country, everyday Russians are losing their appetite for his fight amidst the grief that so much death has caused and the looming economic and demographic problems on the horizon. Conscripting 160,000 soldiers may end up being the straw that breaks the collective Russian back. And if that's the case, Putin may have just found a way to end his Ukraine invasion, only that ending won't be what he wanted. But what do you think about Russia's latest and largest conscription drive of the Ukraine war? What impact will it have on ceasefire negotiations? How do you think Ukraine will react? And what does all of this mean for Russia's future? Share your thoughts with us in the comments, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more commentary on the latest developments in the Ukraine war. We're an independent source for accurate, up-to-date military conflicts around the globe and appreciate your support.